The humid evening air hung thick over the underground command bunker in Manila on November 8, 1944. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood motionless before the large strategic map that dominated the operations room, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back. The dim electric lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows across the colored pins and strings that marked fleet positions, supply lines, and combat zones across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Kurita saw on that map, combined with the intelligence report stacked on his desk, would force him to confront a truth so devastating that it would shake the very foundation of everything he had believed about Japan's sacred mission in this war. The admiral had spent 30 years rising through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had commanded destroyers in the China campaigns, and had led cruiser divisions with distinction. He had been present at the triumph of Pearl Harbor, had witnessed the glorious expansion across Southeast Asia, and had believed with absolute certainty in the superiority of Japanese spirit and tactical brilliance. But the documents before him told a different story, a story so incomprehensible that even now, staring at the irrefutable evidence, his mind struggled to accept what his eyes were showing him. This was not the war he thought Japan was fighting. This was not the enemy he had been taught to understand, and the implications of what he was beginning to grasp would soon spread through the highest levels of Japanese command, forcing men who had built their entire lives on certain assumptions to face a reality that rendered those assumptions not just wrong, but catastrophically, fatally mistaken. The rising sun had cast such a long shadow across the Pacific in December of 1941. Vice Admiral Kurita remembered that morning with crystalline clarity, the moment when news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached his cruiser division off the coast of Formosa. The officers had celebrated with sake, convinced that this bold strike would cripple American naval power and force the industrial giant to negotiate a favorable peace. Japan's fighting spirit, they believed, would overcome any material disadvantages. The warrior code of Bushido would prove superior to American softness and love of comfort. Those early months had seemed to confirm every assumption. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the impregnable fortress of British power in Asia, surrendered in just over 2 months. The Philippines were conquered despite fierce resistance. Japanese carriers roamed the Indian Ocean, threatening British possessions from Ceylon to the coast of Africa. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was becoming reality, and Japan's military leadership saw in these victories the validation of their strategic vision. Kurita himself had participated in the Java Sea campaign, where Japanese naval forces had demonstrated tactical superiority that seemed to justify decades of intensive training and preparation. The American Asiatic fleet had been scattered and destroyed. Dutch and British naval forces had been swept aside. Japanese pilots flew with precision and daring that no Western power could match. Japanese torpedoes ran true and deadly. Japanese night fighting techniques proved devastatingly effective. The strategic calculations that had guided Japanese planning seemed sound. America was a nation of individualists who valued comfort over sacrifice. American sailors were poorly trained compared to Japanese veterans. American industrial capacity, while impressive, would take years to mobilize effectively for war. The vast distances of the Pacific would work in Japan's favor, stretching American supply lines while Japan consolidated its resource-rich conquests. Most importantly, Japanese planners believed that 1 or 2 major defeats would break American will
to fight, leading to negotiations that would recognize Japan's new empire. But by the summer of 1942, small details began to trouble observant officers like Kurita. The Battle of Coral Sea, while tactically inconclusive, had somehow halted the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. The Americans had lost a fleet carrier, but they had also sunk a Japanese light carrier and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku so severely that it required months of repairs. More troubling was the loss of veteran air crews that Japan could not easily replace. Then came Midway in June 1942, and for the first time, a cold finger of doubt touched the hearts of some Japanese naval officers. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day. Hundreds of experienced pilots killed. The elite striking force of the WWII effectively destroyed. Official explanations blamed bad luck, poor reconnaissance, and unexpected American tactical advantages. But Kurita, reviewing the battle reports, noted details that disturbed him. The Americans had possessed intelligence that seemed impossibly accurate. Their carriers had appeared exactly where they could deliver maximum damage. Their dive bomber pilots had pressed home attacks with determination that contradicted assumptions about American fighting spirit. Still, these concerns were largely suppressed in the aftermath of Midway. Japan still possessed a formidable navy. New carriers were under construction. The resource zones of Southeast Asia were being exploited to feed Japan's war machine. The defensive perimeter across the Pacific Islands would make any American counteroffensive prohibitively costly. Time remained on Japan's side, or so the High Command insisted. Kurita's doubts deepened during the Guadalcanal campaign that began in August 1942. The initial reports had seemed routine, another small American landing on an obscure jungle island. Japanese forces would counterattack and drive the Americans back into the sea, as they had done repeatedly in the early months of the war. But Guadalcanal did not follow the expected script. American forces established themselves on the island and refused to be dislodged. Japanese attempts to reinforce their garrison met increasingly effective resistance. The naval battles that raged in the waters around Guadalcanal throughout the fall and winter of 1942 demonstrated American resilience that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Yes, Japanese night fighting tactics scored victories. Yes, American losses were heavy, but the Americans kept coming. What troubled Kurita most was not the tactical outcomes of individual battles, but the strategic pattern that was emerging. Every naval engagement around Guadalcanal saw American forces growing stronger, while Japanese strength gradually eroded. Japanese ships damaged in battle took months to repair because of limited dockyard capacity. American ships seemed to return to combat with impossible speed. Japanese aircraft losses could not be replaced quickly enough. American aircraft appeared in growing numbers. The Tokyo Express supply runs to Guadalcanal became increasingly costly. Japanese destroyers, forced to use high speed to avoid air attack, burned fuel at rates that strained logistics. American air power, both land-based and carrier-based, grew more numerous and more capable with each passing month. The Americans were learning, adapting, and improving at a pace that seemed to violate Japanese assumptions about Western fighting capabilities. By February 1943, when Japan finally evacuated Guadalcanal, Kurita was among the officers who recognized that something fundamental had shifted. This was not the quick war of decisive battles that Japanese planning had envisioned. This was becoming a grinding war of attrition. And in such a war, industrial capacity would matter more than fighting spirit. The intelligence summaries that crossed Kurita's desk in 1943 contained information that he initially dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Reports claimed that American shipyards were launching escort carriers at a rate of 1 per week. Liberty ships, the basic cargo vessels that sustained Allied offensives around the world.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Logistics were being built in weeks rather than months. American aircraft production numbers seemed fantastical, impossible for any single nation to achieve. Surely these figures were inflated by American propaganda designed to intimidate and demoralize. But Kurita was a methodical man who believed in understanding his enemy. He began collecting data, comparing reports, cross-referencing information from multiple sources. What he discovered disturbed him profoundly. The numbers, as incredible as they seemed, were not propaganda. They were conservative estimates of actual American production. In 1942, American shipyards had launched approximately 8 million tons of merchant shipping. Japan's entire merchant fleet at the start of the war had been roughly 6 million tons, and submarine warfare was steadily reducing that number. The Americans were building more ships in a single year
than Japan possessed in total, and this was just their merchant construction. Naval construction was proceeding on a similarly massive scale. American aircraft production in 1943 exceeded 80,000 planes. Japan's entire aircraft industry was producing roughly 16,000 planes per year, and the quality gap was narrowing as American designs improved while Japanese designs stagnated due to resource constraints. The Americans were not just building more aircraft, they were building them with standardized parts, efficient assembly methods, and quality control that Japanese industry could not match. The implications were staggering. Every aircraft Japan lost required scarce resources and skilled labor to replace. Every American aircraft lost was simply another unit in a production line that seemed capable of infinite output. Japanese pilots, trained over years to achieve the elite status of naval aviators, were irreplaceable. American pilots were being trained in accelerated programs that produced competent aviators in months, and they were arriving in the Pacific in numbers that seemed to increase exponentially. Kurita shared his analysis with fellow officers during a planning conference in Rabaul in mid-1943. The response was mixed. Some officers, particularly younger ones, who had experienced combat in the Solomons campaign, nodded grimly in recognition. They had seen American strength growing with their own eyes. But senior officers, particularly those based in Tokyo and removed from frontline realities, rejected his conclusions as defeatist thinking. Japanese spirit would prevail over American materialism. Superior training and tactics would overcome numerical advantages. The Americans lacked the will for sustained warfare and would eventually seek peace. These reassurances rang increasingly hollow as 1943 progressed. The Central Solomons campaign saw Japanese forces steadily pushed back despite determined resistance. The New Guinea campaign demonstrated American capability for sustained offensive operations across difficult terrain. Japanese garrisons, cut off from resupply by American naval and air superiority, fought with desperate courage but were systematically reduced and eliminated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided Kurita with personal experience of the new reality. Commanding cruisers in the screening force for the Japanese carrier fleet, he witnessed what American pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation, once the finest in the world, was massacred by American fighters operating from carriers that seemed to be everywhere at once. Kurita watched as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft flew toward the American fleet. He watched as fewer and fewer returned. The Americans possessed radar that detected incoming attacks from distances Japanese officers had thought impossible. American fighters, guided by this radar, intercepted Japanese strikes long before they reached the carriers. American anti-aircraft fire directed by radar fire control created walls of exploding steel that shredded Japanese formations. The Japanese lost approximately 600 aircraft in 2 days of fighting. 3 carriers were sunk, along with other vessels. The Americans lost approximately 100 aircraft.
Were sunk. The American losses were minimal. This was not a battle. This was an execution. And Kurita, watching from his cruiser's bridge, understood with cold certainty that the war was lost. Not because Japanese sailors lacked courage, not because Japanese commanders lacked skill, but because Japan was fighting an enemy with resources so vast that courage and skill were simply overwhelmed by material superiority. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was conceived as Japan's last desperate gamble to reverse the course of the war. The plan was complex, involving multiple fleet elements converging on the American invasion force in Leyte Gulf. If successful, the destruction of American amphibious shipping would delay the Philippines campaign for months, perhaps buying time for negotiations. Kurita commanded Center Force, the main striking element built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. These vessels represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval architecture, mounting 18-inch guns that could destroy any ship afloat. Supported by cruisers and destroyers, Kurita was to transit the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable American transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. The passage through the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th shattered any remaining illusions about Japanese naval power. American air carrier aircraft attacked center force in successive waves throughout the day. The super battleship Musashi, designed to withstand any punishment, was hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. The great ship fought on for hours, her damage control parties performing miracles of seamanship, but eventually capsized and sank with over 1,000 crew members. Kurita watched this demonstration of American air power from Yamato's bridge. The attacks came with methodical precision. American pilots coordinated their strikes, torpedo bombers attacking from both sides simultaneously to prevent evasive maneuvering, dive bombers following immediately to exploit damage and confusion. The Americans possessed enough aircraft to maintain continuous pressure, replacing losses without apparent difficulty, sustaining attack intensity that Japanese planners had believed impossible for carrier aviation. The cruiser Miyoko was torpedoed and forced to withdraw. Multiple other vessels took damage. Center force pressed on, but Kurita understood that he was leading his ships into a death trap. American carriers were operating somewhere beyond the horizon with impunity, launching strikes without fear of counterattack, because Japanese carrier aviation had been effectively destroyed in the Philippine Sea. That night, transiting San Bernardino Strait, Kurita faced his moment of truth. His orders required him to press forward into Leyte Gulf, accepting losses to destroy American shipping. But what would such sacrifice achieve? Sinking transports and supply ships would be tactically satisfying, but strategically meaningless. The Americans would replace losses within weeks. His fleet, once destroyed, could not be replaced at all.
Absolute determination, trading their lives to buy time for the carriers. American pilots, flying aircraft that had been loaded for ground support rather than naval attack, improvised attacks with whatever weapons they carried, some making dry runs without any ordnance at all, simply trying to distract and confuse Japanese gunners. Kurita's forces sank several escort carriers and destroyers, but the action devolved into a confused melee that lasted for hours. American aircraft from multiple sources swarmed over center force. Reports came in suggesting that fast American carriers were approaching from the north. Intelligence was fragmentary and contradictory, and gradually watching his cruisers take damage from destroyers that refused to die, watching his carefully preserved fleet being drawn into exactly the kind of grinding engagement that favored American material superiority, Kurita made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He ordered center force to withdraw. The decision was militarily sound. Pressing forward would have resulted in the destruction of Japan's last battle fleet for minimal strategic gain, but it also represented an admission that Japanese naval power could no longer achieve decisive victory even under theoretically favorable circumstances. The Americans, with hastily organized forces of secondary vessels, had defeated Japan's premier battle fleet through determination, improvisation, and the deep reservoir of material resources that allowed them to absorb losses and continue fighting. It was in the aftermath of Leyte Gulf, sitting in his quarters aboard Yamato as the battered fleet limped back toward Japanese waters, that Kurita began compiling the report that would eventually reach the highest levels of Japanese command. He wrote methodically, setting down observations and conclusions that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as defeatist thinking. American industrial capacity was not measured in terms familiar to Japanese planning. It was not a matter of Japan producing 100 aircraft while America produced 200. The ratios were more like 1:5, 1:10 in some categories. And the gap was widening, not narrowing. Every day the war continued. American strength increased while Japanese strength diminished. American logistics operated on principles that seemed impossible to Japanese understanding.
Supply chains stretched across the vast Pacific, delivered fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food with reliability that Japanese logistics could not match even in home waters. American ships operated with fuel expenditure that would have crippled Japanese operations because American tankers ensured constant supply. American tactical capabilities had evolved rapidly through the war. Early American torpedoes had been notoriously unreliable. By 1944, American torpedoes were highly effective. Early American night fighting techniques had been inferior to Japanese methods. By 1944, American radar had neutralized Japanese night fighting advantages. Early American carrier aviation had suffered from coordination problems. By 1944, American carrier task forces operated with precision that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional attack. Most fundamentally, American society had mobilized for total war in ways that Japanese planners had not believed possible for a democratic nation. The soft, comfort-loving Americans of Japanese propaganda had revealed themselves to be capable of sustained sacrifice, industrial mobilization, and military adaptation that surpassed Japanese capabilities in every measurable category except individual courage. And courage alone could not win modern naval warfare. Kurita's report reached Manila in early November 1944, where it joined similar assessments from other senior officers who had confronted the same realities. Admiral Soemo Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, read these reports with growing alarm. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, recently appointed chief of staff, added his own observations based on the Philippine Sea disaster. The picture that emerged from these compiled assessments was
devastating. Japan had been fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy with the wrong assumptions from the very beginning. The war of quick, decisive battles that would break American will had never been possible. American will had proven unbreakable. The long war of attrition that Japanese planners had sought to avoid was exactly what the war had become, and in such a war, Japan was doomed. On November 8, 1944, the date that Vice Admiral Kurita stood before the strategic map in the Manila bunker, a small group of senior Japanese naval officers gathered for an informal conference that had no official record. These men, veterans of decades of naval service, had to confront truth that violated everything they had built their lives upon. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer who had been collating intelligence reports, presented data that could not be disputed. American aircraft carrier construction had placed over 100 carriers of various types in service or under construction. Japan's entire carrier fleet at the start of the war had been 10 carriers. The Americans had built 10 times that number in 3 years of war. American destroyer production had exceeded 300 vessels. American submarine construction had created a fleet that was systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. Japanese submarine doctrine, focused on attacking warships, had achieved minimal strategic impact. American submarine doctrine, targeting merchant shipping, was strangling Japan's economy and severing the resource zones from the home islands. The numbers were relentless and undeniable. Steel production, aluminum production, oil refining capacity, electrical generation, transportation infrastructure, every measure of industrial capability showed American advantages that ranged from 5-to-1 to more than 20-to-1, depending on the specific category. And Japan's advantages? The superior training of individual sailors, the tactical brilliance of commanders, the fighting spirit of the warrior tradition, all these intangibles that Japanese planning had relied upon had proven insufficient against material superiority of such overwhelming magnitude. The discussion in that Manila bunker was frank in ways that would have been impossible in formal settings. These officers admitted to each other what they could not say in official reports. Japan had lost the war. Not would lose, had lost. Past tense. The outcome was already determined. The only question was how long Japan would continue fighting and at what cost. Some officers argued for immediate negotiations to secure the best possible terms before American strength grew even greater.
Others maintained that Japan must fight on to preserve honor and perhaps extract concessions through making the invasion of the home islands prohibitively costly. But none of them, not one single officer in that room, believed that Japan could achieve actual victory. Vice Admiral Kurita spoke last, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of hard experience. He described watching Musashi die under American air attack, the greatest battleship ever built, reduced to a sinking wreck by aircraft launched from carriers that remained beyond visual range. He described the chaos of Samar, where American escort carriers and destroyers had fought with desperate courage that matched anything in Japanese naval tradition, backed by material reserves that allowed them to sustain losses that would have crippled Japanese forces. He told them about the intelligence assessments that projected American carrier strength in 1945 at levels that would make Japanese naval operations effectively impossible, about American plans for B-29 bomber campaigns that would systematically destroy Japanese cities and industrial capacity, about American submarine warfare that had already reduced Japanese merchant tonnage to critical levels and would soon make the importation of vital resources impossible. And he told them, finally, that every day the war continued would see the gap between American and Japanese capabilities widen further, that the decisive victory Japanese doctrine required was no longer possible to achieve, that continuing the war under current strategies was not determination or loyalty to the emperor, but criminal negligence that would result in the pointless deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese servicemen and civilians. The silence that followed Kurita's assessment was heavy with the weight of military careers built on assumptions that were now revealed as fatal errors. These men had devoted their lives to preparing for a war that they now understood they should never have fought. The strategic vision that had guided Japanese expansion, the belief that will and spirit could overcome material disadvantages, the confidence that one or two decisive victories would bring America to the negotiating table, all of it was revealed as tragic miscalculation. Captain Omai broke the silence by pointing out that these realizations, while accurate, could not be transmitted through official channels. Japanese military culture punished defeatist thinking harshly. Officers who expressed doubt about ultimate victory risked removal from command, disgrace, even imprisonment. The truth about American strength, while undeniable to anyone with access to accurate intelligence, remained officially unacknowledged because acknowledging it would require admitting that the entire war had been a catastrophic mistake. The officers discussed how to communicate these realities to higher command without being dismissed as defeatists or cowards. They debated whether it was even possible to change Japanese strategy at this late stage, whether the military and political leadership in Tokyo would accept assessments that contradicted years of propaganda and official optimism. Vice Admiral Fukudome suggested that the evidence would have to come not from analysis and argument, but from undeniable demonstrations of American capability, something so overwhelming that it could not be explained away by tactical errors or bad luck, something that would force even the most optimistic officers in Tokyo to confront the reality of Japan's situation. That demonstration was already being prepared, though the officers in Manila did not yet know its form. The first B-29 Superfortress raid on Tokyo would come days later on November 24, 1944. These massive bombers, flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, represented American technological and industrial capability in its most visible form. The raids would intensify through the winter and spring, culminating in the firebombing campaigns that would devastate Japanese cities. But even B-29 raids could be rationalized as temporary problems that Japanese air defenses would eventually solve. What could not be rationalized, what would finally force comprehensive admission from the highest levels of Japanese command, was still months away. The officers in Manila that November evening understood the truth. The question was whether their superiors in Tokyo would understand it in time to save Japan from complete destruction. As the meeting broke up and officers returned to their duties, Vice Admiral Kurita remained at the strategic map. He traced the shrinking perimeter of Japanese control, the scattered island garrisons that were being bypassed and left to wither, the supply lines that American submarines were severing one by one. He thought about the young sailors serving aboard the remaining ships of the combined fleet, men who believed their sacrifices were meaningful, who trusted that their leaders had strategies that would lead to victory. How did you tell them that their courage, real as it was, would not be enough? How did you explain that the war they were fighting had been lost before it truly began? That the calculations underlying Japanese strategy had been based on misunderstandings so fundamental that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could compensate? Kurita did not have answers to these questions, but he knew, with the certainty that comes from direct experience of combat against a superior enemy,
that the truth would become undeniable eventually. The only question was how many would die before that truth was officially acknowledged. The humid Manila evening offered no comfort as he finally left the operations room, his mind heavy with knowledge that felt like betrayal, but was simply reality confronting illusion. The war would continue for 9 more months after that November evening in Manila, 9 months of desperate fighting, suicidal tactics, and escalating destruction. The officers who had gathered in that bunker understood what was coming. They knew the trajectory. They could see the ending approaching with the inevitability of a mathematical proof. But they remained bound by duty, loyalty, and a military culture that could not easily admit error or accept defeat. The American strength that they had finally grasped was not simply a matter of numbers, though the numbers were overwhelming. It was a complete system, industrial, technological, organizational, and cultural, that approached warfare with methods and resources that Japanese planning had never seriously contemplated. Understanding this system, really comprehending its scale and efficiency, required setting aside assumptions that had guided Japanese military thinking for decades. These officers had made that difficult intellectual journey. They had looked at the evidence with clear eyes and reached conclusions that contradicted their training and experience. In the months ahead, more officers would make the same journey as American power continued to manifest in ways that could not be explained away. Eventually, even the most committed believers in Japanese victory would have to confront the reality that a few clear-sighted men had already grasped in November 1944. But by then, the cost of that delayed recognition would be measured in cities burned, ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost in a war whose outcome was already determined. The tragedy was not just military defeat. It was the recognition that the defeat had been inevitable, that the war need never have been fought, that every life lost after a certain point was sacrifice without purpose or meaning. Vice Admiral Kurita would survive the war and spend his remaining years wrestling with these questions. He had done his duty as he understood it. He had commanded forces with courage and skill, but he had also served a strategic vision that was fundamentally flawed, and that knowledge would haunt him more than any tactical failure or operational setback. The night deepened over Manila, and in bunkers and command posts across the shrinking Japanese defensive perimeter, other officers were reaching similar conclusions based on their own experiences. The war was lost. American strength was overwhelming. Continuing to fight would achieve nothing except additional destruction. But saying these truths aloud, transmitting them through official channels, acting on them with policy changes, all of that remained impossible within the constraints of Japanese military culture and political reality. So the war would grind on, consuming lives and resources in pursuit of an objective that thoughtful officers already knew was unattainable. The shocking admission of American strength had occurred, but only in private conversations among men who understood the implications. The public admission, the official recognition, the policy changes that might have saved countless lives, those would wait for demonstrations of American power so overwhelming that they could not be explained away or rationalized. Those demonstrations were coming. The officers in Manila that November evening knew it. They could see it approaching in the intelligence reports, in the patterns of American operations, in the relentless growth of enemy capability. What they could not know was exactly what form those demonstrations would take or how the final chapters of the war would unfold.
But they understood, with grim certainty, that those chapters would be written in fire and blood, that the ending was already inevitable.
Determined, and that the tragedy of the Pacific War was entering its final, most devastating phase. The winter of 1944 brought a cold clarity to Japanese military headquarters that no amount of official optimism could dispel. As American forces tightened their grip on the Philippines and prepared for the final advances toward the home islands, intelligence reports flowing into Tokyo painted a picture so stark that even the most fervent believers in ultimate victory began to question their assumptions. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who now served in a staff position due to injuries, found himself assigned to a special intelligence analysis unit. His task was to compile comprehensive assessments of American capabilities based on every available source. What he discovered in the weeks following the Leyte Gulf disaster forced him to confront conclusions he had been avoiding since Midway. The files stacked in his office contained captured American documents, reports from agents in neutral countries, technical analyses of recovered equipment, and interrogation transcripts from captured American personnel. Each source, examined individually, was troubling. Examined collectively, they revealed a pattern of American strength that exceeded Japanese planning assumptions by orders of magnitude. American aircraft carriers were not just numerous, they were sophisticated beyond anything Japanese industry could produce. The Essex-class fleet carriers incorporated damage control systems, radar equipment, and aircraft handling facilities that represented technological advantages Japan could not match. But more disturbing than their individual capabilities was their sheer number. Intelligence confirmed that 24 Essex-class carriers were either in service or under construction, and this figure did not include the scores of escort carriers being mass-produced for convoy protection and amphibious support. Fuchida examined technical drawings of American radar systems recovered from downed aircraft and sunken ships. The sophistication of these devices challenged fundamental Japanese assumptions about technological development. Japan had radar technology, but American radar operated at frequencies and power levels that provided detection ranges Japanese equipment could not achieve. American fire control radar could track multiple targets simultaneously and direct anti-aircraft fire with accuracy that made daylight bombing attacks suicidal. The reports from submarine commanders told their own devastating story. Japanese submarines, designed for fleet actions against warships, had achieved modest tactical successes but minimal strategic impact. American submarines, targeting merchant shipping with ruthless efficiency, had sunk over 4 million tons of Japanese vessels by the end of 1944. This represented more than half of Japan's pre-war merchant fleet, and the losses were accelerating. What made these submarine losses particularly catastrophic was their impact on resource flow. Japan's entire strategic concept had depended on securing resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and transporting those resources to the home islands for processing and manufacturing. American submarines were severing this lifeline systematically. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, all of these vital materials were increasingly trapped in their sources of origin, unable to reach Japan because the sea lanes were too dangerous. Fuchida compiled statistics on Japanese aircraft production and pilot training that revealed problems far deeper than simple numerical inferiority.
Went beyond production numbers. The quality of Japanese aircraft was stagnating or declining, while American aircraft improved with each new model. The Zero fighter, once superior to all opponents, was now outmatched by American Hellcats and Corsairs. Japanese bombers lacked the defensive armament and armor protection that American designs incorporated as standard features. Japanese aircraft engines, starved of the high-octane fuel they required for optimal performance, operated at reduced power settings that degraded their combat effectiveness. Most critically, Japan was losing its pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The multi-year training pipeline that had created the elite aviators who struck Pearl Harbor could not be sustained under wartime conditions. Accelerated training programs produced pilots with minimal flight hours and inadequate combat preparation. These inexperienced aviators, facing American pilots who benefited from superior aircraft and more extensive training, died in numbers that guaranteed continuing decline in overall Japanese aviation capability. Fuchida's analysis reached a conclusion that he knew would be unwelcome at higher command levels. Japanese aviation was in a death spiral. Losses exceeded replacement capacity. Quality was declining. American opposition was strengthening. Within months, perhaps weeks, Japanese air power would cease to be an effective fighting force. The implications for defending the home islands were obvious and terrifying. In a parallel effort, Commander Masataka Chihaya was analyzing American logistics and industrial organization. What he discovered challenged his understanding of how modern warfare functioned at the operational level. American supply chains operated with redundancy and capacity that seemed wasteful by Japanese standards but provided resilience that Japanese logistics could not match. American forces in the Pacific received supplies with reliability that Japanese commanders would have considered miraculous. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, food all arrived at forward bases with clockwork regularity despite operating across thousands of miles of ocean. American ships carried cargo in standardized containers that could be handled efficiently. American bases employed specialized equipment for rapid cargo transfer. American supply officers used inventory management systems that tracked material flow with unprecedented precision. The contrast with Japanese logistics was stark and humiliating. Japanese supply operations suffered chronic shortages of transport capacity, inadequate port facilities, inefficient cargo handling procedures, and communication systems that could not coordinate complex supply movements. Japanese units in forward positions often operated on the edge of starvation and ammunition exhaustion, not because Japan lacked resources, but because those resources could not be delivered effectively to where they were needed. Chihaya documented cases where Japanese garrisons had been overwhelmed not by superior American combat power, but by superior American logistics. Well-supplied American forces could sustain offensive operations indefinitely. Poorly supplied Japanese forces, no matter how determined, eventually ran out of ammunition, food, or medical supplies and had to surrender or die in place. The systematic nature of American logistical superiority indicated organizational capabilities that operated at a level of complexity Japanese institutions had never achieved. American military logistics was not just about moving supplies. It was an integrated system incorporating production planning, transportation scheduling, inventory management, and consumption forecasting that treated the entire Pacific theater as a single operational problem to be solved through systematic application of industrial methods. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the Kamikaze program, reviewed these assessments with growing frustration. The special
attack tactics he had pioneered represented Japan's admission that conventional naval aviation could no longer achieve meaningful results against American forces. By training pilots to crash their aircraft into enemy ships, Japan was effectively converting aircraft into guided missiles, trading the life of a pilot for potential damage to an enemy vessel. The kamikaze attacks had achieved some tactical successes. American ships had been sunk or damaged. American sailors had died. But Onishi, examining the strategic implications, understood that special attacks represented desperation rather than effectiveness. Japan was sacrificing its remaining pilots and aircraft for results that barely slowed the American advance. The kamikazes were militarily significant primarily as indicators of how completely conventional Japanese aviation had failed. The moral implications troubled Onishi despite his reputation as a hardliner. Japanese military tradition honored sacrifice and self-denial, but it had never systematically demanded suicide as tactical doctrine.
The kamikaze program violated fundamental principles about the value of trained personnel and the importance of preserving experienced warriors for future battles. That Japan had resorted to such methods indicated how thoroughly American material superiority had exhausted conventional options. Reports from kamikaze pilots who had survived aborted missions due to mechanical failures or weather provided insights into American defensive capabilities that reinforced conclusions about the overwhelming nature of American strength. These pilots described approaching American fleets only to encounter walls of anti-aircraft fire so dense that reaching targets required flying through explosions that shredded aircraft before they could strike. American radar detected incoming attacks from distances that allowed fighters to intercept most kamikazes before they reached the fleet. American Combat Air Patrol maintained continuous coverage that made successful attacks dependent on luck rather than skill or courage. The kamikaze program was achieving hit rates of approximately 15%. This meant that 85% of special attack aircraft were being destroyed without inflicting any damage on the enemy. From a purely military perspective, these were catastrophic loss rates that would quickly exhaust Japan's remaining aviation resources. From a human perspective, these numbers represented thousands of young men dying in attacks that achieved minimal strategic impact. Lieutenant General Toroshiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, contributed Army perspectives to the growing realization of American strength. The Army's experience in the Pacific campaigns had paralleled the Navy's trajectory from early victories to grinding defeats. What Kawabe found particularly disturbing was the evolution of American ground combat capabilities. Early American forces in the Pacific had fought with determination, but without the combat experience and tactical sophistication of Japanese veterans. Guadalcanal had been a learning experience for both sides. But by late 1944, American ground forces had evolved into highly effective combined arms teams that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support with deadly precision. American infantry units employed firepower in ways the Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. Where Japanese infantry relied on rifles, grenades, and machine guns, American infantry operated with organic support weapons that included mortars, rocket launchers, and flamethrowers as standard equipment.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.